Lumen students, it is week 20 and this is your Tuesday video. We're going to cover some history topics today and I'm dressed like a monk. So we're going to be talking about a Catholic monk. This Catholic monk had kind of a change of heart. We're going to learn a little bit more about Martin Luther and how his actions really sparked the Reformation, really a revolution that took place in the Catholic Church. So let's first begin by looking at this video, and then I'm going to read you a little bit more about him.
There's none of that sort of revolutionary, rebellious nature in the background of Martin Luther. There's nothing which gives you the indication this was a man destined to confront the Catholic Church or change European history.
But at 21, Luther commits his first act of rebellion, leaving his family and his studies to become an Augustinian monk. Life in the monastery is made up of hard work, frequent prayer, and fasting. As a monk, Luther is obsessive in his search for personal purity and struggles to understand his relationship with God.
That was at the core of Luther's angst, this haunting question, have I done enough to please God?
The last straw for Luther, a church practice that scandalizes him, the selling of what are called indulgences.
It was believed that while none of us could pile up enough good works to be saved, the saints had done a superabundance of them. And they developed a kind of a treasury of merits and graces that could be drawn upon.
Access to that treasury is what the church sells to the people, for themselves, for friends, for loved ones who have already died, or even for sins to be committed in the future. For Martin Luther, this spectacle is a sign that the Catholic Church has lost its way. Luther wants to start his debate with a set of ideas about what is wrong with the Church. His so-called theses, 95 in all, are formally titled Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. They go beyond the sale of indulgences to address the limits of papal power. In 1521, Luther is summoned to appear before the Pope's political commander for that area, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Emperor opens an official church meeting called a Diet in the German town of Worms. In Worms, Charles V, with Pope Leo's permission, declares Luther a heretic and banishes him from the Holy Roman Empire. Here in Wartburg Castle, Martin Luther took refuge for 10 months following the Diet of Worms. Confined to the castle grounds, Luther begins the next stage of his rebellion, translating the New Testament into German.
Hey, I hope you were interested in that short video clip. It was fascinating to me to learn a little bit more about Martin Luther. Let me just share with you what it says in the Story of the World. Okay. Martin Luther grew up in a part of Europe that we now call Germany. His parents wanted him to be a lawyer, but Martin Luther decided to join a monastery instead. As a monk, he had to beg for food and money. He spent long hours praying and studying the Bible. Martin Luther chose this difficult, demanding life because he was afraid that God would punish him for his sins unless he worked day and night to make God happy. He wrote that he was walled around with the terror and agony of God's anger. Martin Luther did everything that the church told him he should do. He went on pilgrimage to Rome. He prayed in front of the relics of saints. He crawled on his hands and knees, reciting the Lord's Prayer to show how sorry he was for his sins. But he was still afraid that God would be displeased with him. After he had been a monk for 5 years, Martin was sent to teach at a university in the German city of Wittenberg. He taught his students about the book of Romans in the New Testament, and he spent hours studying this book. As he studied, he began to change his mind about what God wanted from him. He thought to himself, the book of Romans doesn't tell me that I have to earn God's love by working hard to be good. No, it says that God gives me the power to believe in him and the power to be good because he already loves me. This changed Martin's way of thinking about God. Later he said, it seems to me as if I had been born again and as if I had entered paradise through newly opened doors. Think about it this way. Imagine that you have two aunts. Both of them say that they love you. But the first aunt lives in a very clean house with a white rug on the floor. When you come to visit her, she opens the door and looks at you very carefully to see if your hands and shoes and face are clean before she lets you in. During your snack, she keeps checking to see whether you're sitting straight and chewing with your mouth closed. When you drip a little bit of hot chocolate on the sofa, she gets rubber gloves, a big bucket of hot soapy water, and a sponge, and she makes you scrub at the stain, but it won't come off. So she shouts, leave this house at once and don't come back until you learn how to eat neatly. Now imagine that you go to see the second aunt. She throws her door open and says, I am so glad to see you. Come in. And she hugs you even though you've been playing in the dirt. You get a little bit of mud on her apron, but she dusts it off and says, why don't you wash your hands before you have a snack? The bathroom has good smelling hand soap and big blue towels in it. After you wash your hands, she takes you into the kitchen, sits you down at a big wooden table for your cookies and hot chocolate. When you spill a little, she gives you a napkin and says, that's not the worst thing that's been spilt on this table. When your snack is done, she says, let's go upstairs and do some finger painting in the playroom, and then you can have a bubble bath to wash off. Which aunt would you rather go see? The first aunt is a little bit like the way Martin Luther used to think of God, and the second aunt is more like the way he learned to think about God after reading Romans. And when Martin Luther looked around, he saw that many other people also seemed to have the wrong ideas about God. And he thought that the church's teachings made these wrong ideas stronger. The Catholic Church had begun to teach that God would only forgive sins if the sinners did penance, special deeds like giving money to the poor or confessing their sins in public to show how sorry they were. But the church also taught that sinners could get out of doing penance by paying a certain amount of money to the church. This practice was called selling indulgences. And Martin Luther believed that the indulgences were wrong. He preached that God would forgive any sinner who believed in Jesus Christ, not just those who did penance or bought indulgences. Christ has nowhere commanded indulgences to be preached, he wrote. So he made a list of 95 reasons why indulgences were wrong. And on October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed a copy of this list called the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. This was his way of inviting other churchmen to argue with him about his ideas. But Luther found that people all over Germany were interested in his list. Soon hundreds of people were discussing Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And for the first time, people were beginning to say out loud that the Catholic Church might not always have the right ideas about God. Well, this new way of thinking was spread rapidly because of another significant individual, and his name was Gutenberg and his great invention. Okay? Think about the Middle Ages, knights in armor, stone castles, food cooked over open fires, long journeys on horseback, silk and spices from India. Now think about the world today. Cars, airplanes, telephones, computers, Legos, movies. What invention did the most to change the world? The answer might surprise you. The printing press. Without printed books, the Renaissance might never have happened, and our modern world would look very different. Before the printing press was invented, books were written by hand. You remember reading about medieval monks who copied out manuscripts in their monasteries. They had to make paper called parchment out of animal skins. Then they had to mix up ink, sharpen a feather into a pen, and write out each letter of each book. One book might take years to finish, and when it was done, it was put in the monastery library and chained to the shelf so that no one could take it away. Only kings and very rich men could afford to have books in their homes. There were no picture books, no magazines, no newspapers, no printed instructions or directions. During the Middle Ages, merchants trading with China learned how to make paper from the Chinese. This paper was made by soaking bark, straw, or old rags in water, pressing it into sheets, and drying it. Paper was much easier and quicker to make than animal skin parchment. Now these merchants could keep record of how many pieces of silk or pottery they had sold. But they still had to write all their facts and figures by hand. There were still no books. Imagine for a moment that you lived in a world without printed books, instructions, or directions. You want to play a new board game that came with 5 different sets of playing pieces, a spinner, 2 dice, 1 black, 1 yellow, and a funny metal chain with triangular links. But there are no instructions. How will you figure out what to do with all the game parts? Eventually, you might figure out how to play a game with the board and the parts, but your rules probably won't be like anyone else's. If you visit friends who have the same game, you won't be able to play with them until they explain all their rules. Pretend that you're a scientist who wants to study the stars, but you don't know what other scientists have already discovered about the stars because you don't have any science books. All you have are your eyes and the sky. After years and years of study, you figure out some basic facts about the stars, but it takes you so long to learn these simple facts that you never discover much more. All over the world, other scientists are doing the exact same thing, so no one gets very far in his study of the stars. If only you had books. Then you could each learn the basic facts in just a few months of study and add to those facts. Suppose you're a Christian who wants to find out what the Bible says about right and wrong, but you don't have a Bible. There's a huge Bible chained to the pulpit of the church in your village, but it's written in a language you can't read, so you ask your priest what the Bible says. He doesn't read very well either, so he tells you what his priest told him years ago when he asked the same question. He might be right, but he might be wrong. That's what life was like in Europe during the Middle Ages. Because there were so few books, scientists didn't make very many new discoveries. Historians couldn't find out much about the past. Doctors knew very little about the human body. And Christians had to find out what the Bible said by asking their priests. Then everything changed. A young man in Germany, the same country as Martin Luther, was learning how to be a goldsmith. His name was Johannes Gutenberg. As he melted his gold and silver and pounded the metal and poured the metal into molds, Johannes Gutenberg began to wonder whether he could also mold letters out of metal. He thought to himself, I could fit the letters together to form a metal page. Then I could dip this metal page down into ink and press it onto paper. I could make hundreds of paper copies in no time at all. And then I could rearrange the letters to make another page. Gutenberg experimented with finding just the right kind of metal for his pages. It had to be soft enough to press down on a page without shattering, but hard enough to stay in shape. He had to make molds for each letter, pour the letters in, wait for them to cool, and then remove them. His ink had to be just the right thickness, thick enough to cling to the metal when he dipped it in, but thin enough to come off the metal onto the paper. He had to find a way to lift the metal page up and press it down over and over on sheet after sheet of paper. After years of experimenting, Gutenberg made a printing press from an old wine press that had been used to squeeze grapes. He made metal letters out of a mixture of tin, lead, and a poisonous metal called antimony. He made a new kind of ink with oil in it and began to work on his great project, a Bible. It took him several years to set all the metal letters into place for the pages. But once the pages were set, Gutenberg and his 20 helpers printed 450 Bibles in 1 year. If 20 monks had tried to write out these Bibles by hand, it would have taken them 90 years each. Gutenberg began printing his Bibles in 1455 and 1456. In the following years, others borrowed Gutenberg's technique. An English merchant named William Caxton got interested not just in printing books, but in translating them into the languages that people could actually read. He printed books of history and poetry in English. He also printed a book about how to play chess, the very first set of printed directions. As time went on, more and more books were printed. Books became cheaper and cheaper. More and more people could buy and read them. Now every day, ordinary men and women could read about the past glories of Greece and Rome. Explorers could find out what other explorers had discovered in their journeys. Scientists could read what other scientists were learning and doing in other countries. and Christians could read their own Bibles written in their own languages. That is hugely significant. Can you imagine the difference that Martin Luther and that Johannes Gutenberg made in the world? I'm so grateful for them. I love books, and I love to share information that I learned from books with you. So thanks for joining us for our history video today. If you want to watch on Thursday, I have several fun projects or activities that you could do that go along with the Reformation. So we'll catch you then in, Wednesday and Thursday's videos. See you then.